The small Swiss village was quiet, resting between tall mountains where time seemed to move slower than in the big cities. Among the narrow streets and stone houses lived a man named Jakob. He was a father of 3, a simple man with tired eyes, worn hands, and clothes that never seemed new. Life had not been kind to him. He worked when he could find work, mostly labor jobs that paid little, and his family often struggled to keep food on the table. Yet Jakob carried a story inside him, one that he repeated more times than anyone cared to count. For years, Jakob told his family and neighbors about a closed military bunker hidden high in the mountains. According to him, when he was younger, he had worked on construction projects near the site. He remembered how soldiers would suddenly arrive, how they would guard trucks loaded with heavy crates, and how one day, without warning, the entire place was sealed. The entrance was covered with thick steel doors, and no one was ever allowed back inside. Jakob believed with all his heart that something valuable was hidden there, but no one else believed him. At the village tavern, when Jakob sat down with other men after a day of work, his words often brought laughter rather than respect. He would say quietly, "There is something in that bunker. I saw the soldiers bring it in before they closed the place forever." The other men would laugh, shake their heads, and call him a dreamer. Some joked that he was confusing memories. Others said he invented stories to make himself feel important. A few even told him that hunger and poverty had twisted his mind. Jakob never argued back with anger. Instead, he would sip his drink, lower his eyes, and repeat only one sentence. "One day you'll see." His children did not escape the embarrassment either. At school, other children teased them, saying their father was crazy, that he made up ghost stories about the mountains. His eldest son begged him more than once, "Papa, please stop telling people about the bunker. They all laugh at us." Jakob would simply place his hand on his son's shoulder and reply, "Truth does not depend on laughter. Even if they mock me, the truth stays the truth." At home, his wife often sighed when she heard him mention the bunker again. Their cupboards were nearly empty, and she reminded him that stories could not feed the children or pay for firewood in winter. Sometimes she grew angry, saying, "Jakob, stop chasing shadows. You speak of this bunker as if it will change our lives, but it is nothing. We must live in the real world." Her words hurt, though she never meant cruelty. She was simply tired of living with hardship and disappointment. But Jakob could not erase the images from his memory. Decades ago, when he was still strong and full of energy, he had worked for weeks near that mountain. He remembered seeing men in uniforms, their faces tense, their voices sharp. Trucks had rolled in during the night, carrying crates that required several men to move. He had seen how carefully those crates were handled, as if the contents were fragile or precious. Then, without explanation, everything stopped. The soldiers welded the doors shut, built thick barriers, and declared the site closed. Workers were dismissed, told to forget what they saw. Most men did forget, moving on to other jobs in other towns, but Jakob never forgot. Now, years later, when his hands were rough from work and his pockets nearly empty, the memory remained as bright as fire. He felt as though a voice inside him whispered each time he looked at the mountains, "The secret is still there." The villagers, however, saw only a poor man who refused to let go of the past. When he walked to the market, some would whisper behind him, "There goes Jakob, the man of fairy tales." When he stopped to buy bread, the baker would sometimes ask with a smirk, "So Jakob, have you opened your treasure chest yet?" Others laughed louder when he passed by, making jokes about him finding gold bars behind his wooden fence. Jakob pretended not to hear, though inside, he felt the sting of every word. But his pride was not for himself, it was for his children. He wanted them to know that he was not a fool, not a liar. He only wished for the day when they would understand why he had held on to his story so stubbornly. Often, when work was scarce, Jakob would climb the path toward the mountain alone. The trail was steep, covered in rocks and thick pine trees, but he walked with patience. When he reached the site, he would stand before the sealed steel doors, now rusting from years of rain and snow. Moss covered the stones and plants grew through cracks in the concrete. The air was colder there, as if the mountain guarded its secrets tightly. Jakob would place his hand on the door and whisper to himself, "You are still here. I know you are." The mountain never answered, but the silence only deepened his belief. Back in the village, his family grew tired of his wandering. His wife scolded him for wasting time. His children avoided the subject altogether. and his neighbors openly laughed when they saw him return from the trail with muddy boots. Still, he did not give up. Some nights, as the family sat around the dim light of a single lamp, Jacob told his children the story again. He described the night the soldiers locked the doors, the sound of welding, the way the trucks disappeared into the darkness. He told them of the feeling in his heart that day, a certainty that something extraordinary had been hidden away. His youngest daughter listened with wide eyes, whispering, "What do you think it is, Papa?" Jacob smiled faintly and replied, "Something that belongs to history, something too important to vanish." The child's faith warmed him, even when the others rolled their eyes. Jacob was not an educated man, nor a man of wealth or influence, but he had something stronger than both, memory and conviction. Even if the whole village mocked him, he believed that one day the truth would walk out of the mountain, and when it did, the laughter would finally stop. Until then, he carried his secret like a torch in the dark, guiding him through a life of struggle and ridicule. To everyone else, Jacob was only a poor father, clinging to a foolish tale. But inside, he knew his story was not just a dream. It was a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Jacob's story about the bunker was more than just a tale for him. It was a memory that clung to his mind like ivy on stone. He carried it everywhere he went, though most people brushed it aside as nonsense. As the years passed, the memory of his time near that mountain grew sharper in his thoughts, almost as though it wanted to remind him that what he had seen long ago was real. He remembered those days as a young man when he worked with other laborers in the cold mountain air. They were building supply routes, carrying heavy stones and laying down materials. Soldiers often stood nearby, their boots planted firmly, their eyes watchful, their rifles hanging from their shoulders. There was always a tension in the air, as if something greater was happening beneath the surface. Jacob and the others had never been told much. They were paid to work, not to ask questions, but Jacob could not help noticing. He saw strange trucks that came at night, always under heavy guard. The trucks carried wooden crates, large ones, that needed 4 men to lift. Some crates gave off the metallic clink of something solid inside, while others were handled with delicate care, as though fragile treasures rested within them. Jacob would catch glimpses before the soldiers ordered everyone to look away or move on. Then one morning, everything changed. The workers were told their contract had ended. Soldiers welded massive steel doors over the entrance to the underground structure. Sparks flew as flames touched the metal, sealing it shut forever. Jacob stood with other laborers, watching silently as the doors were locked, never to be opened again. Trucks and soldiers vanished, and no explanation was given. For most of the men, the memory faded into nothing. But for Jacob, it became a seed that grew larger with each year. In the present, Jacob's life was filled with hardship. His home was small, with a roof that leaked during storms. The wooden floors creaked under every step, and the furniture was old and patched. Winter was the hardest season. The mountains brought heavy snow, and his family often had to gather wood from the forest to keep warm. They ate simple meals, bread, potatoes, and sometimes soup made from bones. His wife managed the household with quiet strength, but there were days when even she could not hide her worry. Their children grew up hearing their father's story again and again. His eldest son Marcus had lost patience. At 18, Marcus worked in a nearby town to earn money and disliked being associated with the man of the bunker story. He told his father more than once, "Papa, people laugh at us because of this. Why can't you just let it go? It's been so many years." Jacob would look at his son, his eyes soft but firm, and reply, "Because the truth does not vanish, Marcus. Just because people laugh does not mean it is a lie." But his words rarely changed Marcus's mind. His middle child, Anna, tried to ignore the matter. She focused on school and helped her mother at home. She avoided speaking of the bunker altogether, pretending as though it was not a part of her life. Yet deep down she wondered why her father clung so strongly to this memory. Only his youngest daughter, little Greta, still listened with shining eyes. At night, when Jacob tucked her into bed, she would ask, "Papa, do you think there's treasure in the bunker?" Jacob would smile and kiss her forehead. "Maybe," he would whisper, "or maybe it is something else. But I know it is something important." Despite the warmth in his daughter's belief, Jacob faced daily ridicule outside his home. At the tavern, men often mocked him openly. "Jacob," one would shout across the room, "when are you going to open your magic doors and bring us gold?" The others laughed until their bellies shook. Another man once said, "If there's treasure in that mountain, then I'm the king of Switzerland." The laughter grew louder and Jakob sat quietly, his hands folded, his gaze lowered. Some days Jakob's heart grew heavy with doubt. He wondered if perhaps he had carried the memory too long, if maybe he had convinced himself of something greater than reality. But each time he walked up the mountain and stood before the rusted steel doors, the certainty returned. The doors were real, the secrecy was real, and whatever lay behind them had been hidden for a reason. In the village, people did not understand. To them, Jakob was simply a poor man stuck in the past. He wore old jackets patched at the elbows, his shoes often cracked at the soles. He worked odd jobs, carrying lumber, repairing fences, or hauling stones for wealthier families. No one could see how a man like him could hold the key to anything important. Their minds refused to imagine it, so they laughed instead. But Jakob's story was not only about the bunker. It was also about his pride. His family might not have wealth, but he wanted them to know that he had once witnessed something extraordinary. He wanted them to believe he was not just another forgotten laborer in history. Sometimes, late at night, when the fire burned low, Jakob's wife would sit beside him in silence. She would sigh and say softly, "Jakob, why do you torture yourself with this? Even if there was something, it is gone now. Soldiers took it away. We must think about the children, about tomorrow, not about the past." Jakob would nod, but his heart resisted. "I cannot forget what I saw," he whispered. "It was not nothing. One day the world will know." His wife shook her head, knowing she could never change his mind. In the quiet of his thoughts, Jakob carried both the pain of ridicule and the strength of conviction. He knew that the truth could sleep for many years, buried under dust and stone, but it could not be erased. He believed with every beat of his heart that someday someone would open those doors. And when that day came, the world would understand why he had never stopped speaking. The villagers saw him as a poor dreamer, clinging to shadows of the past. But to Jakob, he was simply a witness waiting for the truth to rise again. The years passed quietly in the small Swiss village, and Jakob's story about the bunker became more like a local joke than a mystery. Most villagers thought it was just one of those tales that old men carried to feel important. But fate often works in strange ways, and Jakob's quiet conviction was about to meet unexpected visitors who would change everything. One summer morning, a group of outsiders arrived in the village. They were younger men and women, carrying backpacks, cameras, and notebooks. They were not farmers, not locals, and not tourists either. They were urban explorers, adventurers who searched for forgotten places, old bunkers, and abandoned buildings. They had read about hidden Swiss military tunnels from the Cold War and had come to map out sites that had been sealed for decades. Their presence in the village stirred curiosity. Children followed them at a distance, whispering about strangers who looked more like students than travelers. The villagers welcomed them politely but also kept their distance, as was common in small mountain communities. Over drinks at the tavern, the explorers asked about abandoned bunkers in the region. They wanted stories, maps, or even rumors. It didn't take long before Jakob's name came up. Someone smirked and said, "If you want stories, talk to Jakob. He's been dreaming of treasure behind steel doors all his life." The tavern erupted with laughter, but the strangers grew curious. Later that evening, they found Jakob outside his modest home, repairing a wooden fence. One of the explorers, a tall man named Lucas, introduced himself. "We hear you know about a bunker nearby," he said. His tone was half serious, half doubtful. Jakob looked up from his work, his eyes calm, and nodded. "I do. I saw it with my own eyes when I was younger." The explorers exchanged quick glances. They had expected exaggeration or drunken stories, but Jakob's voice was steady and sure. They pressed him for details. Jakob told them about the soldiers, the late-night trucks, and the sealing of the steel doors. He described the path up the mountain, the moss-covered stones, and the silence that wrapped around the place like a cloak. At first, the explorers smiled politely, thinking it was just another old man's tale. But something in Jakob's words felt different. He spoke not like a storyteller, but like a witness. Finally, Lucas asked, "Would you take us there?" Jakob hesitated, studying the strangers carefully. Then he nodded. "Yes, tomorrow." The next morning, Jakob led the group up the rocky path that wound through pine forests and streams. His steps were slow but steady, each one guided by memory. The explorers carried equipment, metal detectors, cameras, and drones. Jakob carried nothing but his walking stick. The climb was long, but when they reached the spot, Jakob pointed to the rusted steel doors buried into the mountain wall. "Here," he said simply. The explorers stopped, their eyes wide. They had expected ruins, maybe a collapsed cave or a forgotten cellar. But the massive doors were real, thick steel plates welded shut with faded paint that once carried military insignias. Time had eaten at the surface, but the structure was intact. Moss and vines crept over the concrete, but the air around the place carried a heavy silence, as if it still guarded its secret. One of the explorers stepped closer, running his hand along the cold surface. "Incredible," he whispered. Another pulled out equipment to measure thickness and density. The detectors signaled faint metallic echoes behind the wall, stronger than they expected. Excitement flickered in their eyes. Jakob stood a few steps back, watching quietly. For the first time in years, he was not alone in his belief. Someone else was seeing what he had carried in his memory. He felt a warmth in his chest, but he said nothing. Word of the discovery spread quickly through the village. By the next day, people were whispering about Jakob again, but not with laughter this time. Some villagers followed the explorers up the path to see for themselves. Soon, photographs appeared on social media, catching the attention of journalists and officials. Within weeks, the once forgotten steel doors became the center of attention. Authorities arrived to inspect the site. Engineers in helmets tapped the walls, scanned the ground, and took samples. They found signs that the structure extended deep into the mountain, far larger than anyone had imagined. Historical records confirmed that several Swiss bunkers had been built and sealed during the Cold War, but this particular site had no official mention. That mystery only deepened the intrigue. Jakob's neighbors, who had mocked him for years, now avoided his eyes when they passed him in the street. The laughter was gone, replaced by quiet shame. Some tried to act as though they had always believed there might be something there, but Jakob said nothing. He was not interested in their apologies. He only watched as the truth he had carried for decades began to awaken. Journalists came with cameras asking Jakob to tell his story again and again. He repeated the same details calmly, never adding more than what he had seen. "I was just a worker," he told them. "I saw soldiers. I saw trucks. I saw the doors close. That is all." To the reporters, his simplicity was powerful. Experts set up camp near the mountain. Machines hummed day and night, scanning for tunnels and chambers inside. Results showed vast hollow spaces hidden beyond the steel doors. Engineers explained that whatever lay inside had been sealed carefully, not abandoned in haste. Something important was indeed behind those walls. The village buzzed with rumors. Some whispered of weapons, others of gold reserves hidden to protect the nation during war. A few even imagined priceless documents or rare artifacts. Children ran through the streets pretending to be treasure hunters, and older villagers shook their heads in disbelief. Through it all, Jakob remained calm. He spent his days sitting near the site, watching the officials work. He did not claim glory or boast to those who had mocked him. Instead, he simply waited, knowing that the moment of truth was drawing near. For the first time in decades, Jakob felt the weight of ridicule lifting from his shoulders. The explorers had confirmed what he always knew. The authorities had found signals of something hidden. The laughter of the past was gone, replaced with questions and curiosity. And while the world now speculated wildly, Jakob needed no guesses. He only carried a quiet certainty. Whatever was behind those doors was worth hiding, and soon it would no longer remain hidden. The mountain had kept its secret for years. But now the world was finally listening. The day finally came when the heavy silence of the mountain was broken. For weeks, engineers and officials had studied the sealed bunker doors. They used scanners, drills, and even ground-penetrating radar to measure what was inside. Each test confirmed the same thing. Large, hollow chambers stretched far beyond the steel barrier, and strong metallic signals echoed from within. It was clear now. Something important had been locked away. The government decided to open the bunker carefully. This was no simple task. The doors were reinforced with layers of steel and concrete, designed to withstand decades of weather and even war. Machines were brought in, massive drills, cranes, and cutting torches. Workers in helmets and uniforms surrounded the site, their movements cautious and steady. Soldiers guarded the perimeter to keep curious villagers and reporters at a safe distance. From the village, People climbed the trail daily to watch from behind the safety ropes. Journalists set up cameras, their lenses pointed at the steel doors. Reporters whispered into microphones, sending live broadcasts to audiences across the country. The once quiet mountain now echoed with the hum of machinery and the chatter of human excitement. And among them sat Jakob. He carried his old walking stick and wore the same patched coat he had worn for years. He did not push to the front or demand attention. He simply sat on a rock, his eyes fixed on the doors, watching history unfold. Those who had once laughed at him now glanced at him with uneasy respect. Some villagers nodded silently as they passed him, ashamed of their earlier mockery. Jakob responded with nothing more than a faint nod. His dignity was not in their approval. It was in the truth he had carried all his life. The work was slow. For days, sparks flew as torches bit into the steel, sending showers of fire down the mountain's surface. Each groan of metal made the crowd hold its breath. Slowly, piece by piece, the outer layers were weakened. At night, lights were fixed around the site, turning the mountainside into a glowing camp. Workers labored in shifts, determined to uncover what had been hidden for so long. Finally, after weeks of relentless effort, the first crack appeared. A small hole was cut through the steel, just large enough to send a camera inside. The crowd leaned forward, silence falling over them as the camera's light flickered across the screen. What they saw made them gasp. Beyond the wall stretched a vast chamber lined with crates stacked neatly as if time had never touched them. Dust floated in the beam of the light, but the shapes of the crates were clear, dozens, maybe hundreds of them. Some were marked with faded symbols, others sealed with military insignias long forgotten. The explorers who had first brought attention to Jakob's story exchanged wide-eyed glances. Journalists scrambled to take photographs. Officials whispered to one another, their faces tense with realization. Something extraordinary was waiting inside, but no one yet knew what the crates contained. Speculation ran wild. Some believed they held weapons, perhaps old war machines or dangerous materials. Others whispered of gold, jewels, or secret archives that had been hidden away. Historians suggested they might contain cultural treasures, preserved to be kept safe in times of crisis. Jacob listened to every theory but said nothing. Deep inside, he felt calm. He had seen the crates once before, all those years ago when soldiers had moved them under the cover of night. His heart told him that whatever was inside was not ordinary. It was something valuable, something worth protecting. After more careful planning, the officials gave the order to open the doors fully. With a thunderous groan, machinery pulled away the broken steel, and the entrance yawned open like the mouth of a cave that had been sealed by time itself. Dust poured out in thick clouds, making the workers cough and cover their mouths. Slowly, light spilled into the darkness, illuminating the chamber that had been hidden for decades. One by one, the crates were brought out. Soldiers and workers carried them carefully, their boots echoing on the stone floor. The first crate was opened in front of officials, cameras rolling. As the lid creaked back, gasps filled the air. Inside, neatly stacked bars of gold gleamed faintly under the sunlight. Though dulled by dust, their shine was unmistakable. The crowd erupted in murmurs, and reporters shouted into their microphones. More crates followed, and each revealed something more astonishing: rare historical artifacts, old documents sealed in protective cases, and more gold bars than anyone had ever imagined. Some crates even held priceless artworks wrapped in cloth, preserved with care. The air buzzed with disbelief. Historians declared it one of the greatest discoveries of the century. Economists estimated the total value to be nearly $190 million. Jakob's eyes glistened as he watched. His heart pounded, but not from greed or desire for wealth. It was the weight of vindication. The secret he had carried in silence, mocked for years, was now laid bare before the world. He had been right. Villagers stood frozen, their faces pale with shock. The same men who had laughed at him in the tavern now avoided his eyes. The baker who once mocked him stared at the gold in silence. Children who had teased his sons and daughters now whispered in awe. The whole village felt the sting of shame, realizing that the man they had ridiculed had told the truth all along. Journalists rushed to Jacob, thrusting microphones in front of him. "How do you feel knowing you were right?" one asked. Jacob looked at them with calm eyes and answered simply, "I only told what I saw. The truth never changes." His words spread across news channels, quoted in headlines, and repeated on television. To the world, he was no longer a poor man with foolish stories. He was the witness who had preserved a secret of history through faith and memory. The discovery attracted international attention. Governments debated ownership, historians argued about origins, and treasure hunters whispered about what else might still be hidden in the Swiss mountains. But amid all the noise, Jakob remained quiet. He spent his days near the site, watching the crates being catalogued, his heart filled with a quiet pride. For once, he was no longer invisible. His children looked at him differently now, with respect in their eyes. Marcus, his eldest son, who had once begged him to stop speaking about the bunker, now stood beside him, silent but proud. Anna, who had ignored the story for years, finally admitted to her friends that her father had been right. Little Greta hugged him tightly, whispering, "I always believed you, Papa." The mountain had revealed its treasure, but to Jakob, the greatest treasure was not the gold or the artifacts. It was his dignity restored, his honor defended, and his children's faith renewed. The discovery of the bunker shook not only the small village but also the entire country. Newspapers carried headlines about the $190 million treasure hidden in the Swiss mountains. Television channels broadcast live footage of the golden bars being lifted into the sunlight. Historians were invited to explain why such wealth had been locked away, and politicians argued about ownership. But while the world debated, Jakob sat quietly in the same place he always had, on a wooden chair outside his little home, watching his children play, feeling a peace he had not felt in decades. For Jakob, it was not the money that mattered. It was the truth. For years he had been laughed at, mocked, and even pitied as a poor dreamer. People had whispered behind his back. Children had teased his family, and even his wife had begged him to stop. But he had not stopped. He had carried his memory like a fragile flame in the wind, protecting it from the storms of ridicule. And now that flame had grown into a roaring fire the whole world could see. The villagers could no longer look at him with mocking eyes. Instead, they greeted him with respect, some even with guilt in their voices. The baker, who had once joked that Jakob would never open his treasure chest, now offered him fresh loaves of bread without charge. Men in the tavern lowered their heads when he entered, no longer laughing but instead offering him a seat at their tables. Some even apologized directly, saying, "We were wrong, Jakob, forgive us." Jakob never responded with anger or pride. He only nodded politely and said, "The truth was never mine. It belonged to the mountain. I only remembered." His humility made people respect him even more. His wife, who had carried the weight of worry for years, looked at him differently now. She no longer sighed when he spoke of the past. Instead, she stood beside him proudly when journalists came to take his picture. At night, when the children were asleep, she whispered, "You were right all along, Jakob. I should have believed you." He smiled gently and replied, "You carried this family while I carried the story. Without you, we would not have survived to see this day." His children felt the change most deeply. Marcus, his eldest, who had once begged him to stop embarrassing the family, now walked proudly by his side. He told his friends, "My father was right. He never lied. He never gave up." Anna, who had spent her teenage years avoiding the subject, finally admitted to her classmates that she was the daughter of the man who had uncovered one of Switzerland's greatest secrets. And little Greta, who had always believed, now told everyone in the village with bright eyes, "My papa said it would happen, and it did." The government recognized Jakob officially. They invited him to a ceremony in the capital, where officials thanked him for preserving history and guiding attention to the site. He was awarded a certificate of honor, and though it was not gold or money, it meant more to him than riches ever could. Standing in front of the crowd, Jakob spoke a few simple words. "I am not a scholar or a rich man. I am only a witness. I saw something and remembered it. That is all. The mountain kept its secret and I kept mine. Today they are the same." The hall erupted in applause, and his quiet dignity touched everyone who heard him. Soon experts began cataloging the treasure. Historians confirmed that the gold and artifacts were hidden during the Cold War, stored in case the country ever faced a catastrophic war or invasion. The secrecy had been so complete that even decades later, most records of it had vanished. Without Jakob's memory, the treasure might have remained sealed for another century. Scholars wrote articles calling him the man who remembered when history forgot. The value of the find, $190 million, brought questions about ownership. Some argued it belonged to the government, others to the people. International organizations asked whether any of the artifacts had come from other countries during wartime. Lawyers debated for months, but Jakob did not involve himself in those discussions. To him, it did not matter. The gold was never his to claim. His victory was already complete. His truth had been proven and his dignity restored. Despite this, the authorities did provide his family with compensation for his role. A portion of the funds was set aside for Jakob and his children. His modest home was repaired, the roof fixed and the walls painted. For the first time, his family had enough food for winter, warm clothes, and hope for a better future. Yet Jakob continued to live simply. He still walked to the mountain trails, still carried his old stick, and still wore his patched coat. When people asked why he did not buy new things, he only said, "A coat does not make a man warm. Truth does." The story spread beyond Switzerland. Foreign journalists arrived to interview Jakob, calling him the humble father who outlived laughter. Documentaries were made, showing the journey from ridicule to discovery. Jakob appeared on television, always speaking softly, always giving credit to the mountain rather than to himself. In every image he looked the same, humble, calm, and steady. The change in the village was perhaps the most striking. Where once children had mocked his family, they now listened to him tell his story with wide eyes. Teachers invited him to schools to speak about history, truth, and patience. Villagers who had ignored him now sought his advice, believing that a man who had held on to the truth for decades might have wisdom worth hearing. Jacob, however, never let pride cloud his heart. He always reminded his children, "It is not glory that matters, it is faith. When you know something is true, never let the laughter of others steal it from you." His words became a lesson not only for his family but for the entire community. As time passed, the treasure was moved to museums and secure facilities. Scholars studied the documents, and the artifacts became part of exhibitions visited by thousands. Each plaque carried a note about the discovery, and Jakob's name appeared as the man who had remembered its location. Visitors from around the world learned his story, and some even traveled to the small village just to meet him. In his final years, Jakob was no longer seen as a poor man. He was a symbol of perseverance, of quiet faith in the face of ridicule. He often sat on the same bench outside his home, smiling as children played nearby. The laughter he heard now was no longer cruel. It was the laughter of joy, of a village that had been touched by history. The mountain still stood tall, its forests whispering in the wind, its stones heavy with time, but its greatest secret had been revealed, and with it, Jakob's life had changed forever. He had gone from being mocked to being honored, from being doubted to being believed. And though the world remembered the gold and the $190 million value, Jakob knew the real treasure was something else entirely. It was the respect of his children, the pride in his wife's eyes, and the lesson that truth, no matter how long it is buried, will one day come to light. For Jakob, that was worth more than all the gold in the world.